Now we're going to look at the psychodynamic approach. In his book, The Authoritarian Personality, Theodore Adorno and his colleagues introduced the idea of the authoritarian personality. They proposed that parents who utilized punishment and threats created racial prejudice in their kids because it gave them poor egos. When kids are in an environment that promotes submission to authority, it is typical for them to release their aggression by projecting their anger onto social deviants. They can't attack the authority, so they attack these groups because the authority approves of aggression towards these groups. Members of these groups often include minorities and other groups that are considered inferior by the majority in society. The authoritarian personality was thought to develop during adolescence based on these experiences. Recent research has found that the personality is not specific to a particular national climate. It is a global phenomenon. Additionally, contemporary work has shed a lot of the psychodynamic aspects in favor of social learning aspects.
Now let's take a look at social learning. Social learning was originally proposed and outports the nature of prejudice. According to social learning, kids learn prejudice by observing and imitating role models such as their parents and peers. Alport suggested that first children mimic prejudice, but then they grow to believe it. It is important to note that there is a lot of conflicting research. Some of it supports the idea that kids are influenced by their parents and peers, while some show little or no influence. However, the apparent lack of connection between kids' attitudes and their role models may stem from a lack of explicit discussion, not a lack of influence. Now let's move on to linguistic connotation theorizing. This is a sub-theory of social learning and focuses on very young kids. Researchers hypothesized that racial attitudes were influenced by the connotations surrounding color names. They found that white preschoolers tend to view the color white positively and the color black negatively. This finding was later supported by further evidence indicating a link between color and racial attitudes. Researchers attempted to train the young kids to have positive associations with black and negative ones with white. They attempted to do so by using positive and negative reinforcement. They found that this training weakened the children's original concepts, but it did not reverse them. But it did lead to less negative associations with African Americans, which suggests that children can unlearn prejudice. Now let's look at another theory, the multicultural theory. It states that prejudice develops due to a lack of knowledge and understanding of diverse groups. By learning about cultural groups, people will understand and respect other cultures, which will lead to less negative attitudes. However, there is some criticism with this approach. Critics argue that the celebration of cultural differences may increase the likelihood that kids will place people into rigid categories, thus increasing stereotyping and prejudice. Kids may conclude that race is an important differentiating factor, and the result will be an increase in stereotyping and prejudice. Yet another theory is anti-racist theorizing, which holds that prejudice is the result of a lack of intergroup knowledge, specifically an understanding of the history and roots of inequality. Anti-racist theorizing is often used simultaneous with multicultural education efforts in school. Anti-racist teaching involves descriptions of past and contemporary racial discrimination and inequalities, pointing out the forces that maintain racism. This can increase empathy and decrease racism in the future. However, it could easily backfire as well. Teaching kids about the prejudice their in-group faces, as well as revealing the student's own prejudice, can make some angry or self-righteous. Another criticism is that the classroom materials and activities used can come off as stereotyped, threatening, or humiliating for the minority group being discussed. By taking this approach, it is important to remember that the activities must be suitable for the intended audience, because younger children are less equipped with the necessary cognitive and emotional skills. Overlooking this could have negative effects because improper methods could actually lead to the child demonstrating an increased negativity or avoidance of other racial groups. Now let's take a look at the next one, colorblind theorizing. It argues that prejudice comes from an emphasis on race. Therefore, to decrease prejudice, all we have to do is de-emphasize race. This thinking is in line with the whole melting pot metaphor. One way to try and accomplish this is to focus on our similarities and not our differences. While this sentiment is nice and all, it could have serious repercussions. It's nice to say that we should just ignore race, but race seriously affects a lot of people's lives. So by glossing over race, this approach can facilitate the intolerance certain groups deal with. When racism occurs, the colorblind theory can be used to justify inaction through denial, which helps maintain the power and privilege of the dominant group. Now let's examine mere exposure theorizing, which holds that negative attitudes come from a lack of exposure to outgroup members. It proposes that repeated exposure to an observation of outgroup members in the media can lead to positive intergroup attitudes. However, the results from studies based on the theory of mere exposure have not been encouraging. This may suggest that mere exposure is not adequate enough to change negative attitudes. Now let's move on to extended contact theory, which goes beyond mere exposure theorizing to argue that if someone knows members of their own group are friends with members of another group, more positive attitudes towards that group will emerge. Now, let's look at intergroup contact theory. This theory states that interacting with outgroups creates positive concepts of those groups. Prejudice forms partially from a lack of personal positive interactions with different groups, so it makes sense that a way to combat that would be to promote those kinds of interactions. However, as the desegregation of schools revealed back in the 50s and 60s, the opportunity for interaction isn't always enough. In response, Elliot Aronson developed the jigsaw classroom in the early 70s. The jigsaw classroom is a learning technique that promotes cooperation and interdependence among racially diverse students. This approach was successful in improving the relationship among the kids as well as boosting self-esteem and academic success. However, there is a downside to this technique. Research tends to show that cross-race friendships may not persist after cooperative learning ends.